It was said of the rule of two Sith that they had grown far more powerful than any Jedi. From the time of Darth Bane to the era of Darth Sidious, the Sith had been growing in power in secret for nearly 1,000 years. They altered their approach to conquest by integrating with Republic society and eventually controlling it from within. But this wasn't the only change that the Sith made. During our recent research of Darth Plagueis, we've come to discover that the rule of two Sith had advanced far beyond the Jedi in the realm of the Force. This isn't a claim that we throw out casually or lightly, however, because we aren't merely referring to the potency of a Force wielder, but rather their understanding, their wisdom over the Force itself. The Sith surrounding the generation of Plagueis exhibit abilities that the Jedi themselves never achieved. But this isn't just because the Sith were wielding the dark side, but rather, they looked at the Force a new way. They had taken universal abilities and brought them to brand new heights, far surpassing the powers of the Jedi. So my friends, welcome back to the archives, and let us begin. The Sith Lords of later generations always claimed that they had evolved beyond the Jedi. Terminus himself believed that they could show themselves to the galaxy, and that they could provide the Republic and the public at large with everything they needed, eventually causing the Republic to view the Jedi as completely obsolete. Even Sidious had insisted that the Sith had grown beyond the need for lightsabers, and only now used them symbolically rather than relying on them as a pure tool. Darth Plagueis was one of the opinion that the Sith were of the cusp of ascending to true godhood. Now, while a lot of this could be posturing on their part, there is a grain of truth to the fact that the Sith had indeed surpassed the Jedi in their understanding of the greater Force. It is a hard truth to swallow, but that is why we found evidence to support. And the greatest piece of evidence was the powers that Darth Plagueis could exhibit casually. Plagueis was an extremely rare, unique Sith. He had the capability to sense the very midichlorian count in other beings, and when he refers to this ability, Plagueis speaks of it as though it is old news, something that the Rule of Two had developed long ago. Unlike the Jedi, the Sith did not simply accept any pupil that proved themselves to be Force sensitive. They were much more choosy, and only wanted to find the strongest and train them to be even stronger. Terminus had found Plagueis' father and mother, each of them showing many signs of potent Force sensitivity, and yet, Terminus chose not to settle, and instead manipulated the events for the two of them to interlink, and have them create an even more powerful child. That child would be Plagueis, a boy with the combined midichlorian count of his already highly Force-sensitive parents. This was just a single example of how the Sith will go out of their way to find, or in this case, to make only the strongest of apprentices. And a key ability in doing that was being able to literally perceive the midichlorians in other beings, and their exact count. The reason this is so important is because no Jedi has ever been able to do this in the history of their order, and to our knowledge, not even Grandmaster Luke Skywalker or the Jedi after him could do this. Luke had a method, and this was to use the Force to press on one's subconscious mind. Luke could discern whether or not they were Force sensitive if the person instinctively pushed back. And yes, Yoda had also been known to look into other beings and to sense their connection. And while it was technically possible for an experienced Jedi to divine whether or not one was strong with the Force, the Sith didn't just receive vague impressions on their sensitivity of a being. They could pinpoint exactly how many midichlorians per cell they had. And they could even accurately estimate their current power and their future potential. By the late Rule of Two era, the Sith saw the Jedi's electronic blood tests as archaic and clumsy, a symbol of their fading power. What's more, is that the Sith soon began to beat the Jedi at their own game. One thing that the light side always had an advantage over the dark was the ability of giving life. Force healing was always a power that came much more naturally to the Jedi. They could sustain themselves for long periods of time without mortal sustenance, or soothe the injuries of others. Skilled Jedi healers could even bring back those who were on the brink of death, though this was an intensive process. This power had always been elusive to the Sith. The dark side did not always lend itself to reconstruction and healing. This was a power that traditionally required great compassion. With dark healing, though, it usually required an equivalent exchange. If a Sith wanted to heal themselves or another, it often came at a terrible price. And so for a while after this, the Sith would rely on alchemy, or they would use their injuries to fuel their power until they could find more conventional medicine. Even Darth Bane admitted to the powers of healing being beyond him, and the one advantage that the Jedi had over the Sith. However, dark healing was no longer an issue by Plagueis' era. During his contemplation and experimentation on life, Plagueis says that calling on the Force to mend ruptured arteries, torn muscle, or even broken bone was no more difficult than levitating slabs of stone. At this time, this was a fact of life that came so easily to Plagueis that he wasn't even satisfied with it. Plagueis wanted the midichlorians to cooperate with his nudging so that he could bring a being back to life at any request. But that shows the power of a being able to literally mend organic bodies. This was little more than a convenience to the rule of two Sith, when it was once thought to be impossible. On the other end of the spectrum, the Jedi requires a team of skilled healers specifically dedicated to this one art form to perform feats even similar to this, and never on the scale. Not every Jedi could use Force Heal. As stated before, they could numb pain, soothe wounds, flush foreign toxins and diseases, and encourage life to run its natural course. But one often has to be gifted in healing in order to perform on the proficiency level even close to Plagueis. And again, he saw this as not being enough. The Sith had grown so far beyond the Jedi that they didn't even celebrate these new advancements in the Force. It was something that they had just come to expect as a fact of life. To use a power on a scale the Jedi could only dream of was the bare minimum, and the inability to ascend from this point was always met with frustration over contentment. Plagueis' focus on the midichlorians got to the point of being able to actually bend them to his will. He could persuade, prompt, cajole, and coax them into action, resulting in him discovering a new path towards healing, as he learned how to actually use the midichlorians to do so. It got to the point where he was able to kill someone and then bring them back to life as if it were nothing. This is what the novel says, but having gained the power to keep another alive hadn't been enough for him, and so after Sidious had returned to Coruscant, he had devoted himself to internalizing that ability by manipulating the midichlorians that animated him. For several months he made no progress, but ultimately he began to perceive a measured change. The scars that had grown over his wounds had abruptly begun to soften and fade, and he began to breathe more freely than he had in 20 years. He began to sense that not only were his damaged tissues healing, but his entire body was rejuvenating itself. Beneath the transpirator, areas of his skin were smooth and youthful, and Plagueis knew that eventually he would cease to age altogether. After not having seen his master for months, Sidious meets with him yet again, only to be shocked to find that Plagueis seems to have reversed his age. He no longer looked haggard and decrepit, but appeared to be 30 years younger. Now, of course, manipulating midichlorians is something the Jedi could consider to be unnatural, and they wouldn't go anywhere near abilities like it. But the point we wanted to bring to you is how the Sith had at least gone so far as to closely observe the movements of nature and the midichlorians themselves. And this finally brings us to the why the Sith got so advanced. The Jedi were content with not knowing the will of the Force, believing all aspects of the Force to be unknowable. They didn't bother picking apart their energy field that gave them power, but the Sith had begun to break down, to study the Force at its most basic elements. Plagueis, his master Tenebris, and even Tenebris' own Twi'lek master all fancied themselves as scientists of the Force. They encouraged experimentation of it, and were able to discover many new avenues to power. The Jedi, on the other hand, discouraged experimentation. They held the belief that tampering with the Force too much could lead one to the dark side through greed and obsession, but they never stopped to think or observe how much good could come from making new discoveries in the light side. They only studied what others had come to discover in the past, and rather than trailblazing new avenues of connection for themselves, they grew stagnant, while the Sith continued to advance. In this way, they remained extremely stagnant and even regressed in many aspects. In our opinion, the Jedi Order as a whole only started growing again when under Luke Skywalker's jurisdiction, because of the simple fact that he barely had any knowledge of what had come before. His teaching style heavily emphasized self-exploration. Anytime the students of the Praxium made a discovery, Luke encouraged it by supplying them with whatever scraps of knowledge they could find. And though not as knowledgeable as the old Jedi, the new Jedi Order were largely much stronger and more capable. And we believe that this is at least part of the reason why. The Force itself encourages growth. Its very nature is change, and the cycle of death and rebirth which leads to ultimate balance. The Sith sought to topple this cycle, to place themselves above it, which was an arrogant mistake on their part. However, their path towards their goal ironically led them to gaining a deeper understanding of the Force, allowing themselves to look at it much more closely. And eventually, this resulted in them evolving far beyond their light side counterparts. But now, we need to know your thoughts on the subject. Do you agree with what we found? And do you believe that the rule of two Sith had actually managed to surpass the Jedi in the Force, simply because of this change in philosophy and view on it? Or do you think that there is a more nuanced idea at play, and the Sith were only fooling themselves? But as always, my friends, thank you so much for stopping by the channel and the archives today, and may the Force be with you.